All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. We're forging ahead today. I'm wearing my Nevertheless She Persisted shirt, and we're going to talk about libraries. So this is a topic that we've had actually on the list to discuss for quite a while because Che had proposed to host it and then never got the chance. So Che, this is great. The other thing that's really great is that we really wanted Brian to be able to attend. And Brian is here, so yay for Brian. So there are actually, when I start thinking about libraries, there are so many things that we could get into here. But I want to be making sure that we try to stay, that we don't get caught in one big rabbit hole on one side of a topic and then end up not going on the other side of the topic. So as we start, I want to sort of say that one of the things we should be looking at is how libraries change, and how they are typically portrayed differently in science fiction versus fantasy. Because I think, I don't know. I mean, I think that there are probably a lot. I can think of a number of places where I've seen libraries in fantasy, and they're often places where you find secrets, or forbidden things, magics and such, and in science fiction they are typically non-book,
like databases and things.
Relics. I remember there was a Star Trekian thing where they found like a thing that looked like a blue light bulb full of Jell-O. To figure out that it was some kind of repository of knowledge that had been encoded biologically. And I think that that's actually kind of an interesting contrast because what you're looking at least in that example, is that in the science fictional context there, in the Star Trek context, you're trying to crack the library, as opposed to having the library just be available and full of potentially interesting or dangerous things. So it does make me think about what we're going through right now, in the changes that we're seeing in libraries and ebooks versus paper books. And there are some distinct advantages to paper books, in that they're a lot harder to erase, and they're a lot harder to lose.
Yes and no, they burn real good.
Well, yeah.
Also, most modern books won't survive for as long as older books because of the paper manufacturing processes. Most of the paperbacks that we own will probably be crumbled to dust in about 100 to 150 years, whereas there are books from the 1500s that are still in comparatively good condition.
Well, I mean, parchment, right?
Is it because it's like animal hide parchment?
No, it's
not just.
It's paper manufacturing systems have changed. Our paper is higher quality, but degrades in ways that older forms of paper don't.
Interesting.
No, there's a reason
why. I
why.
could kind of go into the chemistry, but I kind of don't want to.
Yeah, let's
because rabbit hole.
What were you going to say?
I'm just going to quip that there's a reason they called our genre pulp.
Uh-huh.
That is as good a way of expressing it as any.
Yeah.
But I think
I'm in for the concise.
is paper less susceptible to accidental erasure than electronic
Again, it
forms?
depends on the form of erasure.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean,
No,
It's
drop it in
destroyed by
water.
both water and fire. So most natural.
Yeah.
There's a reason libraries are very well protected against the elements, because the elements are totally antithetical to books.
Yeah, right. I mean, you have things like stone tablets but they're not really conducive to volume.
Well, the first libraries were cuneiform tablets. Anyone know
water and fire are big dangers for actual books. I suppose errant keystrokes are dangers to ebooks. Right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, ebooks are not a very archival medium. They've never been designed to be, and all of our digital media has a problem, and we've had this problem since the moment that we have been encoding things. I mean, we've got lots and lots of data on magnetic tapes that we can't read very well anymore. We've got other magnetic media that are doing badly. Our optical media is prone to damage. So when we talk about trying to make sure that our information is persistent, that hasn't been our focus, because we have so much volume that we can easily encode and preserve for the short term.
Yeah.
That we're not really going for the ages, which is a much different thought. So you have a big turning point the minute that printing presses become really accessible.
Yeah.
I think Brian would concur with me on that.
The first thing I was going to say about libraries is that there's really two completely different forms of libraries, in the sense that there are libraries before you have the mass production of and reproduction of printed material, and libraries after. There's very little that they have in common in terms of the way they function. They do the same job. They are repositories of knowledge, but they operate in completely different ways. What somebody would have seen as a library in, say, 1450 compared to what somebody saw as a library in 1600 are vastly, vastly different.
So can you go into that?
Ooh, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
It's down to the ability to reproduce material. Books, prior to the invention and widespread use of the printing press, are precious objects.
Mm-hmm.
They are valuable. They were loaned around Europe between different scholars and universities, so that people could literally copy them and then send the original back again.
Mm-hmm.
There is a very handy book, which I mysteriously have right here.
Mysteriously. What is it?
It's Lisa Jardine. I'll put it in the chat bar. It's by an author called Lisa Jardine. It's called Worldly Goods.
Okay.
It's about the Renaissance. It has a couple of largish sections on the use of books. Basically, it's about how much of the Renaissance was shaped by the trade in valuable goods, and in particular books, and how that changed and how knowledge got spread, in a sense, as part of the fact that people just thought these things were cool and valuable. It kind of had the effect also of passing knowledge around that people otherwise didn't have. People would collect manuscripts because, oh, that's a cool thing and there's only one of these, but then they'd copy those manuscripts, they'd read those manuscripts, they'd employ people specifically to translate old manuscripts, the current languages. So a mania for book collecting helped to spread knowledge rapidly at the start of the Renaissance. So what you have is a situation where libraries certainly existed early on. Books were super valuable. If you look up, how many of you are familiar, and I suspect most of you are now familiar with the concept of what's called the chained library, simply because of Game of Thrones. The first thing I will say about Game of Thrones is it does not accurately represent how a chained library actually looks. It's not a great surprise. The reason I first came across a chained library at school, because the school that I went to was a grammar school founded in the 1500s.
Wow.
And it still had a chained library. It had books on shelves attached to those shelves by chains, because at the time that was set up, those books were so valuable. You couldn't take a book out of the library. You had to stand there by the shelves with the book still attached to the shelf, reading it. There's a reason that there are two different layouts of libraries. Some libraries have what they call the stack system, and some have what they call the wall system. The wall system is where the walls around the library are full of shelves with books on them. The stack system have shelves that are orthogonal to the walls with windows in between. The windows shine light so that when you're standing there at those shelves in those stacks, the light from the window enables you to read the book. The reason it does that is because you're supposed to read the book standing by the shelves, because the book is chained to the shelves.
Oh,
That's
wow.
why stack libraries were invented.
I have a thought about going back to an earlier point that Juliet made about how that some of the information that Brian was talking about maps over into the difference in uses of libraries between science fiction and fantasy, and how like a kind of a more like the way that books were manufactured sort of piece by piece before mass production would kind of give rise to the idea of books as part of a quest in fantasy, and the way that there's a sense of discovery involved in the physical object in a way that you don't see necessarily in hard sci-fi. I think in hard sci-fi, the difference that I notice is that libraries, whatever form they take, tend to be part of the storytelling, but they're sort of background, like not a focal point in terms of quests or plot points necessarily, not in a large way like it is in fantasy. So that's just something I wanted to comment on and kind of bring to the discussion.
I think that's, I mean, I like the idea of books as a quest being, yeah, sort of a fantasy concept. I think it's interesting. And I sort of have, I guess this is kind of a question that I have. So we talked about books as being uniquely valuable objects because that they could not be reproduced.
They could be, but yes, only by hand, by enormous expense,
involving lots and lots of hours,
lots of time and skill,
and copying, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, absolutely. So they couldn't be mass produced. That's what I'm saying. So I have a situation where books can easily be printed, but paper is prohibitively expensive. So I'm kind of trying to, this is making me try to wrap my head around the idea. How valuable would a book be, and why, if producing the information on it was easy, but coming up with the material to print it out on would be difficult?
Do you have the capacity for a palimpsest? Can you wipe out and reprint it over?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about it, but possibly.
I
mean, we have
like what else could you print on? I mean, like plastic. I mean, I guess it depends on like what do you have that's abundant. Fabric can also be printed on quite easily through screen printing, or if you've got like a machine, there's like inkjets you can run fabric through.
Yeah.
So two things here. One is with modern print media, we can do printing onto all sorts of different substrates. And the other is that looking at the impact it has, this is actually where we're at right now with music. It's much easier to produce music than it is to record it, and then having recorded it to pass it on. So we have an existing world analog for this situation.
Can you explain that a little bit more? I mean, explain it, I guess, what you mean by easier to produce than to record.
So you can sing, you can gather together and make music, you can be in a garage band.
Okay.
But setting that down and actually putting it in a form that actually reproduces for somebody else's ears in a different way requires a technology, and it's got a different level of buy-in.
So you're not talking about recording it like recording it on YouTube, but you're talking about putting it down in a written form.
No, I actually am talking about even recording it on YouTube.
Okay.
Even in this age of ubiquitous recording devices, to make it sound good is a different
huge process.
Oh,
this is like the difference between graffiti and a book. You know, I don't want to imply that YouTube is graffiti, but the quality of what happens on YouTube is really highly variable based on what technology is available to the producer or to the compiler or whatever you want to call the person presenting the information. So
right, and
we already know what it's like to have that barrier and what it does to people emotionally and into the whole process of making recording difficult, because this is the classic Western band narrative, right? Oh, now that we've refined our sound and we have our songs down, now we have to figure out how to get enough money together so that we can record.
You've gone staticky, Kat.
Any better?
Yeah.
Any better?
Yeah, that's better.
So what I'm saying is it's the Western band narrative. We've written our songs, we've rehearsed them, we've done some gigs, we've gotten good at it. Now we want a way of distributing our music. Now we have to either learn new skills, or we need to come up with enough money to pay somebody else or to have the equipment.
Yeah.
I want to get into talking about the claim that we don't do science fiction libraries as a quest. I'm thinking about Pern. McCaffrey's Pern.
I haven't read it.
And the computer there is essentially a library.
There is quite a tradition in science fiction of the thing pretty much that Juliet mentioned, i.e. that there is an ancient repository of knowledge, and the key is more how to find and decrypt it. Sorry, I'm getting really bad echo from somebody somewhere.
I am too.
Are we going to try the muting everybody game?
I hope it's not me. Is that better?
I don't hear an echo now. Oh, now I do.
I'm not sure what happened.
Check me.
I just muted and unmuted myself. Is it me?
It could be. You had a funny sort of an audio effect. Is it still here now that Kat is muted?
I don't hear it now.
Nope. Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
Okay. Kat, I think something funny happened with your audio.
Okay, we're going to try this. I had a fan blowing straight at me that was probably adding a huge amount of literal noise. No, I'm still hearing echo.
Is that better, you guys?
No, I'm still hearing echo.
Get back. Oh, man.
Sorry about that. Better?
It's still there, and it's so long that it's really distracting. That's the problem.
I'm sorry, Kat. Yeah, these things sort of happen. And the problem with over here for me is that I can't hear it at all. I was worried it was me. I'm
going to dump out of this, and then I'm going to come back and see what happens.
Okay, thank you, Kat. Appreciate it. So, Brian, can we get back to what you were saying about the ancient repository to find knowledge?
Yeah, I think that's where science fiction tends to use libraries. I'm still getting the echo. Is in terms of there is ancient knowledge you know, from a lost or buried civilization. It's a very, as you mentioned, archaeological kind of approach. There is a library. The information is held in some
archaeological
way.
up.
They did, yes, as I mentioned.
That was Kay
right
earlier. Yeah, so I mean, not in the book that is out on submission, and but in the one after it, I have a library as repository of lost knowledge scenario, and one of the challenges that I'm seeing with it is, in general, I think people find it way too easy to find knowledge. It's too easy to crack the key to the library, and it's too easy to find the knowledge that you need. Oh my gosh, you just stumbled across the thing you needed to know. I mean, I guess, you know, when you look at Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, Gandalf had to go and find this particular little piece of knowledge in all of the Gondor piles of manuscripts, and maybe he knew where it was already at some point, but he did. You do get a sense that he looked for it for a while, I suppose.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm trying to kind of deal with is, I have, you know, the big thing that my characters need to find out from this library, but because I'm annoyed with how easy things are to find, I'm having to try to go, well, I can't just hand it over to the characters, right? I can't make it easy to figure this out. It has to be sort of deductive from some other things that are kind of incidentally obvious in the texts that are in the library. Right?
So we haven't talked about indexes.
Okay, indexes. Let's do it.
Because that's how you hide information in a database or in a library.
Okay.
You leave the information there, but you make it difficult to figure out where exactly it is.
Okay.
Early library indexing systems are kind of interesting. Some of them were divided up by subject, but at least in some universities, they would literally organize by when they acquired the book. So the book that they got first was at one end of the shelf, and then as they got more books, they just literally filed them on and on along the shelves. So if you wanted to find a book, you had to know when they got it.
Wow.
You know, is it 7 or from 1386? Because that'll depend where it is on the shelf. Also, there was a Persian Grand Vizier who allegedly hated to travel without his collection of about 112,000 books and manuscripts. So he had a trained train of camels that traveled with him when he went elsewhere, and they were trained to operate in alphabetical order. To the other end, he could unload the books in alphabetical order. How cool is that?
How many camels is that?
400 camels. I'm not sure how apocryphal all of this is, but it's just so cool that if it didn't happen, it should have done.
Well, you know, I mean, I
think library.
Whether that's apocryphal or not, it's a definite story seed.
That's the kind of thing you want, as like I say, even if it didn't happen, you want it to have happened.
Oh my god, I know, so bad. Oh my god.
Shay. I think Shay.
How many books did you say? 120,000?
I think it was 112,000. I can't say precisely. Many of those would have been very thin volumes, small manuscripts, etc. This was a Persian guy in about 800 AD. He was a Grand Vizier in Persia. I could look up more details at some point.
No, that's okay. It's cool. It's cool. What a cool, what a cool thing.
I know it is the sort of detail you just want to have. You just want to have this scene where the guy arrives at this town with his camels in order, and everyone's going like, "You have to be really careful about unloading. Unload camel A first, then B."
Yes. Alphabetical order camels. Oh my God.
Totally a thing. Totally a thing.
Well, you know, this makes me also think of how information gets retained over time. You've got these catastrophic events that actually I'm surprised nobody has mentioned previously, like the Library of Alexandria, which library fans always go, oh, every time somebody mentions it, where enormous repositories of knowledge are just lost, you know, and unrecoverable. And then then you've got these things like, well, somebody's got it in an attic, or or the Irish had it this whole time, right? You know, I don't know, but I think that the way that knowledge is retained, I'm having a weird metaphor pop up in my head, but it's sort of like the appendix, right? Which is sort of the library of your microbiome, and everything might be swept away elsewhere, but you've got this little spot where everything can be restocked from.
Right. That's why I was saying index, because what happens is if you have like a flat database, for instance, I used to keep all of my Usenet correspondence and email in one file because I was using Netscape.
Yeah.
And then the header gets corrupted and everything gets misfiled.
Oh. Yeah.
But I'm also thinking about, in the last 5 years, we had a problem where a government entity defunded a really major repository of some kind of, I don't remember if it was climatological or biological data, and forced the repository to dump all of its stuff, and not in an orderly fashion, but literally into dumpsters. Yeah, burning down libraries is not the only way we destroy them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that the organization is something that is very easily lost as well. And that's an excellent point.
And without organization, large libraries don't function very well. I sometimes have trouble. I've got about 500 or 600 reference books sitting on these big shelves on my left that some of you have seen from time to time. And yeah, at times I'm going like, I know I've got this book, but I can't remember which section it's in, because if it's not in one of the obvious bits, then they tend to move around as I have to reorganize. There are libraries with 4 million books in them. If you don't know where a given book is, what are your chances of finding it at random?
Yeah.
Praise the Dewey Decimal System.
Yeah. I just put that out, yeah.
There are a number of indexing systems. As I say, that the Dewey Decimal System is kind of good. It still potentially doesn't necessarily help you unless you know specifically what you're looking for. That's the other thing. What happens if you know there is some information in a book and you don't know what the title of the specific book is? You know that information is there, but if you don't know what the title of the book is, how do you know which book to look in of the hundreds or thousands in the library?
And you know, there's another thing that happens with you know, for example, if you are looking at historical events, right? And the order in which they occurred, and trying to find out something like that from a library, it could be next to impossible, because, you know, the reason that we know about events that happened really, really long time ago is because people wrote about them after the fact, right? So if the library is from that time and doesn't have any sort of meta recaps, you're not going to be able to go back and find, hey, here's what happened during this era, right? Because that is not the type of information that is going to be there.
Well, that's even if you have a library. If you're got an oral tradition, then somebody has to have come along and written down your oral stories.
Right.
So I don't know if anybody's tried reading Victorian stories recently where everything is expurgated because everybody knows who the scandal is about.
Oh, yeah.
Except as a modern reader, we have no idea. And it's been really interesting because as I go through my Facebook, I vague book about things and I deliberately don't talk about who the particular person was that enraged me in a particular instance. And very often, in a year or two, I have forgotten who it was, and I'm the one who wrote it down.
Yeah. You know, something interesting like that happened to me recently.
So
we were watching All the President's Men, which is a fascinating and highly relevant film. But one of the things that I thought was interesting about it was it seemed to cut off in this really weird place. It was like, okay, we're setting this up, it's over. And we all looked at each other when the movie finished, very, very confused. This was a few months ago already. And then we looked at when it was made. And we realized that it cut off just at the point where everybody would have known what was going on. Right? Yeah. And so there was this vast piece of knowledge that was considered to be relevant, immediate social context for this film that existed at the time, but doesn't exist now. And in fact, when we were in France this summer and we were in Lascaux, we were looking at the cave paintings. And we don't have any context to interpret those cave paintings. Our sense of the context is very, very limited. You know, we know something about what the people of the time ate, and we know something about what, you know, what kind of diseases they died of. And, you know, we've got some very, very basic archaeological information there. But we have no idea of the social context that creates impetus to make amazing cave paintings or to create particular patterns of cave paintings. And when we were there, my husband said, well, you know, I wish that those guys were here to tell us what they meant by this, you know. And I was sort of being a little flippant. They told us what they meant right here on the wall, but we just don't get it.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure that if you're going to take that much time to make all of those amazing cave paintings, you're trying to make it very clear, right? What they're about and what they're for. But once you've lost that much context, it's very difficult to put it back together. I'm seeing things happening in the chat bar and I'm just not keeping up. Okay, you know what? I'm not keeping up. Do any of you want to bring these topics into the verbal discussion?
I have something that's not from the chat bar I'd like to say, if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay, I was thinking about like what you're talking about in terms of context and libraries and private collections of books and how a collection of material, like in a library, is needed sometimes to access context in order to understand a particular area of study. And like how that would complicate things in terms of world building. Actually, that might apply to your story you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so if you don't mind me being specific for a second, there is a break. There is a catastrophic break in the way that the society in question is being run. And the books are from the period before the catastrophic break. And the people, obviously, who are looking at them are from several hundred years after the catastrophic break. And so essentially what I am looking at is that this is very, very, it's very tricky. And what I need to do is have the people understand that there was a catastrophic break, that this isn't fiction, that it's not, you know, that this isn't describing some kind of science fictional world, but it's describing the way that things used to work around the place. And I have to basically make sure that I'm not having any one book that says, hey, look, there was a catastrophic break. Right? Yeah.
Sometimes those catastrophic breaks are noticeable more by what's missing or what stops, like the geological record, you know, where you can like see there's this big line where a comet hit the Earth or whatever,
okay,
you know.
On staticky chase.
Oh, okay. Well, if you can figure out what's missing. Oh, put it in the chat bar.
Try again. If you can figure out what's missing. Speak, Che.
The absence of a catastrophe points to the catastrophe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like reverse engineering political event.
Yeah. Well, actually, I do have something like that, which is kind of fun. I have a big library in a very prominent, it's not accessible to everybody, but it's a very sort of important place, and it's nearly empty. It has like all these shelves and hardly any books in it. And yeah, so that there are some big hints there. And then they find the books later and they're like, wait a minute, they got moved, you know. So
Who moved my cheese?
Okay, so I'm gonna start trying to find more. So I'm seeing colonization. Catastrophic break. Colonization is a big catastrophic break. And so is war.
Yes,
and actually,
the Mayan codices, we lost huge amounts of information from the Mayan civilization because the Spanish monks basically decided that these were heretical texts and needed to be burnt. We have like 4 left, and there were hundreds upon hundreds of these things.
Well, that's happened in many other contexts too that we know of, right? I don't know that the destruction of the knowledge has been left quite as mysterious as in that context. But I know, like, I vague remembering of history classes where the destruction of libraries was always a big thing during a certain period of time, in order to sort of keep everything controlled by the conquering force. I don't know.
There's a Chinese emperor who ordered the destruction of all materials predating his reign, as far as I remember. I don't remember the details of it right now, but I do know that there are tiny caches of defiant hidden materials that are around.
That was actually very early. That was in the initial Qin dynasty, I think. There was a historian who actually managed to retain a whole bunch of stuff against government orders, which is why that's pretty much the only source we have for very early Chinese history. I am trying to remember if it's... I should know who did that, and I cannot offhand remember. But yes, it was a deliberate thing.
It seems to make the chat go even more horribly echoey, so I'll try to add it later.
I'll take a look. No worries. I'll take a look. No worries.
Well, can anyone speak to what the results of that loss of knowledge are? I mean, we know in terms of looking very far back that like what stinks for us is like, well, what if there's all this cool stuff in there that we don't know, right? Like from a completely selfish modern perspective. But in terms of what it does, the functionality of that particular method of oppression, what it does to a
I can actually talk about that a little bit from a Western perspective. Actually, it's a thing that people who are interested in the early history of the Christian Church are fascinated by, because there's a specific narrative imposed on that history, based on having destroyed documents on persecuting people and all sorts of things, that claims a sort of single consistent stream of philosophy for Christianity that actually isn't borne out when you look at it closely enough. It's based on the victors having amended the history very strongly. We have these impressions of what they've always believed, and things about gender and orientation and intermingling of cultures that as we find other sources, especially we're finding things, for instance, from Vesuvius, that we are actually able to decipher now with more recent technology. We're finding texts that aren't at all supporting the narrative that we've been given.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's like,
and I've seen, I mean, those things will float around Facebook sometimes. But yeah, the gender and orientation parts are actually kind of key.
So, and it's weird because that is reminding me right now about discussions of representation in fiction, and how
representation and quote unquote historical accuracy.
Yeah.
And let me recommend, while we're at while we're on this topic, Medieval POC, who is an incredible resource on the internet for information about presence of people of color in medieval history throughout Europe. And she's amazing, and it's a really amazing a repository of knowledge, which I greatly appreciate. So totally go over there and check it out. But yeah, so there is this tendency to erase the people that we don't appreciate, I guess, marginalized people from these narratives.
Also, Australians are figuring out from new archaeological data and from DNA evidence that the Australian Aboriginal stories about origin and longevity and events are actually as an oral history. And we have a tendency as Western scholars to discount oral histories and to assume that they're all fantastical and inaccurate, but it turns out that there's quite a lot of stuff that is being backed up by physical evidence.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
Well, you know, in terms of oral histories, I think that there's a discipline in terms of passing on oral history, right? Whereas in the Western world, we always think of that game of telephone that we play when we're like in first or second grade, where everything gets a little bit changed. I'm thinking about that.
Yeah.
Attitude towards oral history.
Yeah, I think the assumption is that people aren't spending time memorizing these stories.
I think we go right back to what a library originally was, right? We have these scriptoria, we have these traditions before print of somebody reading the document and other people transcribing it in the West, and the ways in which, for instance, Torahs are still created now, of knowledge of specific ways in which written stuff is transmitted through people as opposed to mechanically reproduced. And we assume that oral history is about games of telephone as opposed to actual discipline.
When it's kind of nuts, because like if you think about like all the iterations and plays and live performances of, let's say, Hamlet, that people have gotten the dialogue exactly dead on, spot on, right? Like, why wouldn't oral history be any less? What's the word I'm looking for here?
I wish we had precise and accurate.
Yes.
I wish we had somebody with an Islamic background here, because I'd love to talk about the ways in which a lot of the learning for young children in traditional Islam is to learn to repeat passages of the Quran precisely, and that there's that would a whole tradition saying that it's not right to translate it.
The way the language of the Quran is, specifically designed to assist in memorization of the exact words that are in use.
Yeah.
It's also a thing that the Islamic sagas and other large oral history works and literary works contain, is the seeds of remembrance within the form of the set of words itself.
Yeah. Well, poetry is very much that. I was actually, this is actually a little bit of an interesting tidbit. My kids are currently in a Shakespeare production of Hamlet, and they're doing it in 2 weeks, and so it's an abridged version, but they managed to retain most of the plot and most of the famous speeches. But one of the things was interesting, that it was that we were looking up the story of, the Danish prince or whatever. And in fact, there are a series of stories about this same set of events that preceded Hamlet, the play. And so in fact, when you look back and you look at what was happening was the set of events between these various recountings is almost identical. But I think, Hamlet, the play, was the one that got retained, which I think is very interesting. And you'd have to say, well, why was it the one that got retained? Well, it was
because it got printed.
Culturally privileged in some way. Also written in poetry. Also, so what are the features of something that would cause it to be the version that gets repeated and retained?
Brian, and
it's not just sitting in a library either. It's being performed. So
isn't Shakespeare's folios one of the first things that was really mass produced?
It's one of the first non-religious books that was mass produced. Although it's interesting how many short political tracts and other things were actually being passed around in the early days of printing, because, well, politics and religion are kind of overlapping. But the early use of printing was in many cases to do with the big Protestant versus Catholic problems, shall we say, in Europe in the 1500s. The first folio wasn't produced until the early 1600s. But yes, it's one of the big things that was printed. I always find it interesting in terms of what does survive and what doesn't. When I was studying Greek, we would translate complete plays that existed. And then there are other plays that we know existed, but we have no copies of, things that are referenced in one work, but nobody has ever come across, So we know pretty much all of Aristophanes' output. We've got quite a lot of Euripides. We've got, various stuff by certain people. And then there are other plays by these people that we don't know. And then there are almost certainly plays by a bunch of other people that we simply have no record of. We don't even know who else might have been minor playwrights around those times. I mean, plays were a big thing for the Greeks.
Yeah.
History is a popularity contest.
The other thing I wanted to mention.
No, it's not. It's a luck contest.
I am rather fascinated, and I guess this is slightly tangential, but I'm going to mention it. So, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is there are a few, I'll call them canons. There are a few canons of work that are retained, and not only retained, but constantly performed. I'm thinking of Shakespeare, but I'm also thinking of the Japanese No dramas, which were all written in a period during the 13 to 1400s, and are still being performed in our best approximation of the original language today. That is, I guess, that's kind of an interesting way of preserving things, and perhaps more like oral history, though you do have written versions of these things. I don't know. But anyway, it's interesting.
So the thing about both of those is that Shakespeare, and we don't often study this in the U.S. this way, is political propaganda, interleaved with a bunch of other stuff. But a lot of that was political propaganda, and that's why it was and everything else. And
yes, I mean,
the No dramas also
his histories in particular were
preserving a culture,
slanted towards a particularly political, popular point of view. The reason we think of Richard III as the evil hunchback and so forth is entirely down to Shakespeare's depiction. It doesn't actually match with a lot of contemporary historical records. The hunchback thing is kind of true. I think when they dug him up under the car park in Leicester, they found he had scoliosis or something. But that we are very, very coloured about what we see in terms of late medieval, early Renaissance English history, not by the actual historical sources, but by Shakespeare's plays and depictions of those kings. What everyone knows about Henry V is from, the plays. It's not from what he actually did, historically speaking.
I do think that's
so. We do the same thing in the U.S.
Yes.
Where our founding father stories are passed down as oral history.
Oh God, yes.
Yes.
And we've got all sorts of stories of apocryphal stuff that they allegedly did. We whitewash the things that happened. We have a narrative that completely erases what actually we were doing.
Yep.
And wow, I'm sorry, I have to bring in the modern day now.
Yeah. It all comes
and
back
this is affecting the way that we're interacting with each other now.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, I mean,
in my
head for that example.
This is why it's valuable to be aware of this stuff. This should be happening in fiction because it happens in real life.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. Do you know anything about the No Plays, Kat?
Okay. I'm sorry, I've been muted this entire time. Well, I will just have to restart all that. So bringing this into the present day, it's affecting the way that we're interacting with each other now. And so last night I just reshared a thing that presented, which is a survey of all of the Black slave rebellion liberation memorial statuary around the Caribbean and South America and Central America. This is something that we never see as white North Americans or non-Black North Americans. It's amazing, and it's a part of the history that we don't talk about. And so you hear white supremacists saying, well, white people would never have been enslaved and stayed that way and been passive. And okay, well, Black people weren't either. There were many, 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 many slave rebellions.
Mm-hmm.
Slave rebellions, and we don't talk about them because we've suppressed that history, because talking about successful slave rebellions is a way of encouraging more.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll go look for that article when we're done here. Okay, so did Reggie want to say something? I can't see her right now, but
yeah, I have to change for work. That's why you're staring at my wall rug.
Oh, no problem. we're over time. So do we have any last thoughts that we want to make sure that we get in before we stop?
I don't want to start down another rabbit hole.
No, because there are so many.
No.
Oh yes, I've touched about a third of the things that I actually wanted to bring up, I think, probably. So.
Brian, I think you need to note them for us so we can go down those other rabbit holes another week.
I'll see what I can come up with.
Do you think you could make some notes and tell us about it in the near future, Brian? Because we would definitely appreciate that.
I was going to rabbit on a bit more about just the history of libraries and how they've changed and how they've varied between being public institutions, private institutions, the kind of access people have to libraries. And we haven't covered that at all.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to know
I have an idea.
Access to information, because that has been controlled in so many different ways through history.
We didn't talk about law libraries.
Oh my goodness.
And research libraries.
Yep, we got to do this again, guys.
Yeah, like, you know, like private university libraries, like you can't just walk onto, or like you used to not be able to just go to the university and use their library. You had to be a student there. And if you couldn't afford to be a student, you couldn't get the books. You couldn't get access.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, the first public library, well, it depends on what you define as public library, but the first one that was actually set up in the remotely modern era was the Malatestine Library, and I can't remember where. It might be Cesena in Italy, which actually I want to say Giovanni, but I could be wrong, specifically willed it to the people of the town, so that he didn't own the books, as he was acquiring, you know, books from here, there, and everywhere. And the whole point was it was for anyone in the town could come to that library and read any of the books.
Wow.
And that was the first time that, it may not have been the first time. We don't know that much about some of the early libraries in Greece and Rome, but they don't seem to have been totally public in the sense that, you know, people didn't have access, but it's hard to say. We can talk about lending libraries.
Yay, lending libraries.
There's
I have a proposal.
Libraries Part 2.
Libraries Part 2, but maybe we should also feature Brian a bit.
Yeah.
No.
Maybe we should have Brian be, you know, a guest on some stuff that he knows. So
because I'm very self-conscious, and also because I can't necessarily guarantee my schedule.
But
we'll see.
Okay, well, so we will do libraries again. I have some notes on what we should talk about. Okay. Next week we're going to talk about naming.
Ooh.
Okay, cool. That one again.
That would be very cool. I will not be here next week. I'm in the Dallas head office, and there is no way I am sitting in my head office on this call.
No problem. But we will talk about naming, and I have some notes written down from our last discussion that to kick us off a bit. So that's what we're going to do. I have a guest lined up for the 30th of the month. It's going to be Alec Navala-Lee, who is going to come and talk to us about his work. So that is kind of fun. And I also just got a guest for September as well. Anne Leonard is going to be on the show. So I'm excited about those folks coming by to talk to us about their stuff. And so I will see you next week to talk about naming. And we'll stop the broadcast. Thanks so much, everybody.